we descend into the frozen archive of the ancient world. We will walk among mammoths that still hold grass between their teeth, among warriors whose tattoos remain vivid after millennia, among children who were offered to mountain gods and were preserved by the very cold that claimed them. We will follow trade routes, frozen into memory, enter bone-framed houses at the edge of existence, and stand in the silence where Viking farms once thrived before the cold returned and swallowed everything. In the places where cold reigns eternal, something remarkable happens to the passage of time. The processes that normally reduce flesh to bone, bone to dust, dust to nothing. These processes slow, then stop, then reverse their usual dominion. The cold becomes curator, the ice becomes archive, and what should have been forgotten is instead preserved, held in frozen suspension until some distant future disturbs the stillness. We are living in that distant future now. The earth is warming, and the frozen archive is opening. From Siberian riverbanks, where spring floods expose tusks that have waited 40,000 years, from Andean peaks, where retreating glaciers reveal offerings made half a millennium ago, from Arctic islands, where permafrost yields secrets it took during the last ice age. The cold is surrendering what it held. This is our moment of revelation, and also of loss. For what the ice preserved, the warming air will claim. We are witnesses to a brief window when ancient secrets emerge into light before vanishing forever into the ordinary decay that warmth permits. Tonight, we explore 12 chambers in this frozen archive, 12 moments when ice and time and human presence intersected to create preservation that seems almost magical, almost sacred. We will meet the mammoth hunters and the golden kings, the tattooed priestesses and the sacrificed children. We will trace the frozen branches of ancient trade routes and descend into caves where fire once burned in darkness, now sealed by ice. We will stand with Vikings at the edge of the habitable world and contemplate what it means that their farms lie buried beneath permafrost that is now beginning to release them. This journey requires patience, requires the willingness to move slowly through landscapes that do not hurry. The cold does not rush, and neither should we. The secrets beneath the frozen tundra reveal themselves to those who wait, who listen, who allow the silence to speak in its own time. So let the evening deepen around you. Let the warmth of where you rest contrast with the cold we explore. Let your breathing slow to match the pace of ice, the rhythm of preservation, the heartbeat of the frozen earth. The permafrost holds more than bodies and bones. It holds atmosphere, ancient air trapped in bubbles, preserving the very breath of vanished ages. It holds seeds that can still germinate after thousands of years. It holds viruses and bacteria that slumbered while human civilization rose and spread across the warming world. It holds carbon that, if released, will change the climate that currently warms us. The frozen archive is not merely historical. It is prophetic, holding warnings and possibilities for futures we can barely imagine. But tonight, we concern ourselves with what has already emerged, with the secrets already revealed, with the stories that the ice has told and is telling. We move through time as we move through temperature, from the deep cold of the Pleistocene to the warming present, from the silence of preservation to the noise of discovery. The journey is long, but the path is gentle. The cold we explore cannot touch you where you rest. You are safe and warm, and the frozen secrets wait to unfold as dreams wait to begin. Let us begin. Let us descend into the white silence where time stopped moving. Let us meet the ancient ones who waited in ice for someone to find them, to wonder at them, to tell their stories to listeners who would hear them across distances of time they could never have imagined. The frozen tundra, the archive of ice, the secrets that cold preserved. They are ready to speak. Are you ready to listen beneath the endless white of Siberia's permafrost? The earth holds breath it took 10,000 years ago. This is not metaphor, but near literal truth. The frozen ground contains air bubbles trapped when mammoths still walked, when glaciers covered lands now temperate, when the world was colder and humans were fewer, and the great beasts of the Ice Age still dominated the northern reaches of the planet. The permafrost is time capsule, is archive, is memory made physical in frozen soil that has not thawed since before the pyramids rose in Egypt. The word itself, permafrost, speaks of permanence, of ground that remains frozen through summer heat, through centuries, through millennia. In Siberia, the permafrost extends hundreds of meters deep in places, layer upon layer of frozen time, reaching down toward bedrock. The surface may thaw each summer, creating the active layer where plants can grow and animals can burrow. But beneath that thin skin of seasonal change lies frozen stability that has persisted since the Pleistocene. This is the ground that remembers. This is the ice that holds. What the permafrost preserves defies our usual understanding of decay. Mammoths emerge from riverbanks with flesh still attached to bone, with hair still covering hide, with stomach contents still identifiable as the grasses and flowers they ate on their last day of life. The Berezovka mammoth, discovered in 1900, had buttercups in its mouth, frozen mid-chew, preserved in the position of a creature that died suddenly and was entombed in cold before rot could begin its patient work. The discovery shocked scientists who had known mammoths only from bones and tusks. Here was the animal itself, imperfect but recognizable, a visitor from the Ice Age arriving in the Industrial Age. The mammoth graveyards of Siberia have yielded thousands of specimens. The Berelek site contains the remains of over 150 mammoths, an accumulation that suggests either mass death event or gradual gathering at a place where the great beasts came to die. We cannot know which. The bones tell only that the mammoths were there, that they died there, that the cold preserved them there until Russian scientists came asking questions the mammoths could only partly answer. What killed them? Climate change, perhaps, as the world warmed and their habitat shrank. Human hunting, possibly, as the first Americans and the peoples of northern Asia learned to bring down the largest land animals they had ever encountered. Disease, starvation, the simple bad luck of falling through ice or becoming trapped in bogs, all possibilities frozen archive. The permafrost has yielded woolly rhinoceros and steppe bison, cave lions, and ancient horses, creatures from an ecosystem that no longer exists, but that the cold preserved, as if waiting for us to reconstruct it. Each discovery adds details to our picture of the Pleistocene world: what the animals ate, how they lived, what parasites troubled them, what injuries they survived. The frozen carcasses are time machines, transporting us to an age when the world was different, when ice-covered lands now green, when humans were new arrivals, sharing the earth with megafauna that had evolved over millions of years. The preservation is so complete that scientists have extracted DNA from mammoth remains, have sequenced genomes, have compared the genetic code of woolly mammoths to modern elephants. The comparison reveals relationship. Mammoths were more closely related to Asian elephants than Asian elephants are to African elephants. A family tree written in molecules that the ice preserved. Some scientists dream of resurrection, of using preserved DNA to recreate mammoths, of returning the great beasts to Siberian landscapes they last walked 10,000 years ago. The dream is controversial, is perhaps impossible, is certainly premature, but the fact that it can be dreamed at all testifies to the remarkable preservation the permafrost provides. The preservation extends to the microscopic. Ancient bacteria and viruses, dormant in permafrost for millennia, can revive when thawed. Scientists have awakened microbes that slumbered for 30,000 years, watching them resume metabolic activity as if the intervening eons were merely a long night's sleep. The discovery raises concerns. What else might wake when the permafrost thaws? What ancient pathogens might emerge into a world with no immunity to diseases that disappeared before human history began? The questions are unanswerable but unsettling. Reminders that the frozen archive holds dangers as well as treasures. And the permafrost is thawing. Across Siberia, Alaska, Canada, the Arctic regions are warming faster than the global average, and ground that has been frozen since the last ice age is beginning to soften. Buildings in permafrost regions are tilting as their foundations shift. Roads are buckling. Coastlines are eroding as frozen soil that held them stable melts into the sea. The transformation is slow by human standards, but rapid by geological measure. Changes that should take centuries are happening in decades. Changes that should take decades are happening in years. The thawing releases what the freezing preserved. Mammoths emerge from riverbanks each spring, their tusks valuable enough that local hunters search for them, their bodies scientific treasures when found intact. But the thawing also releases carbon. Organic matter that was frozen before it could decay now thaws and rots, releasing carbon dioxide and methane into the atmosphere, accelerating the warming that caused the thawing in the first place. The feedback loop is troubling, is perhaps unstoppable, is certainly beyond individual control. The frozen archive is opening whether we are ready or not. We close this first descent into the frozen archive, standing on Siberian tundra, imagining the landscape as it was when mammoths walked here. The same sky stretched overhead, though the stars have shifted slightly in their courses over the intervening millennia. such creatures had ever existed. The ice remembers what we forgot. The ice returns what time should have taken. The frozen archive holds secrets that are emerging now, in our time, in this brief window when the warming earth reveals what the cold preserved. The mammoths speak through their preserved remains, and we are finally learning to listen across the frozen steppes where winds speak in languages older than any surviving tongue. Burial mounds rise like gentle waves on a sea of grass and snow. The Scythians, those nomadic riders who swept across Eurasia 3,000 years ago, left no cities, built no temples, wrote no words. They carried their world on horseback, following herds across grasslands that stretched from the Black Sea to the borders of China, leaving traces so ephemeral that they might have vanished entirely from memory. But they buried their kings in frozen ground, and the cold preserved what should have perished. And now we know them better than many civilizations that built in stone. The Prehistoric tombs lie in the Altai Mountains, where modern Russia meets Mongolia and Kazakhstan and China, where peaks rise above timberline and winters freeze even thought itself. Here, in valleys that trap cold air and create permafrost at latitudes that would not normally support it, the Scythians built burial chambers for their leaders. They dug into frozen earth, lined the chambers with logs, placed their dead with treasures that testified to lives of wealth and power, then sealed the tombs and let the cold return. They could not have known that water would seep through the log roofs, would freeze in the chambers, would create ice blocks that would preserve their offerings for 2,500 years. The first professional excavation at Prehistoric occurred in 1929, when Soviet archaeologist Sergei Rudenko opened a kurgan, a burial mound, and found ice. Not just cold earth, but solid ice filling the chamber, preserving everything it touched. Through the ice, he could see fabric, leather, wood, flesh. The excavation machine recovery mission, chipping away frozen centuries to reveal what lay within. What emerged stunned the archaeological world. Not just gold and bronze and precious objects, but organic materials that normally rot within years, preserved as if the burial had occurred months rather than millennia ago. The textiles told stories that metal could not. Carpets woven with patterns that revealed cultural connections to Persia and China, to civilizations the Scythians had traded with or raided across thousands of miles of steppe. Felt hangings decorated with applique designs showing mythical creatures, griffins and deer, animals that appeared in Scythian art from the Black Sea to the Pacific. Saddle blankets still bearing the impressions of the horses they had covered, horses that were sacrificed and buried with their riders, so that kings might have mounts in whatever afterlife the steppes promised. And the horses themselves, preserved in ice, their bodies arranged, as if still running across plains that no longer exist. The Prehistoric burials included multiple horses in each tomb, as many as 14 in one chamber, their bridles decorated with gold, their manes trimmed in patterns that suggested ritual significance, their bodies positioned to accompany their riders into death. The preservation was so complete that scientists could determine what the horses had eaten, could analyze their stomach contents, could reconstruct the diet of animals that had been dead for 25 centuries. But the most startling discoveries were the bodies themselves. The Scythians practiced mummification, not the elaborate process of Egyptian embalmers, but a practical preparation that removed internal organs and replaced them with grass and hair, that preserved the external form while preventing immediate decay. The ice completed what the embalmers began, freezing the prepared bodies before bacteria could accomplish their work, holding the dead in suspension between life and dissolution. When the ice melted in excavation, the bodies emerged, not skeletons, but preserved humans, their features recognizable, their skin intact, their tattoos still visible. The tattoos, the Scythian tattoos, are among the most remarkable discoveries from the frozen archive. Elaborate designs covered the arms and legs and torsos of the Prehistoric dead, deer with fantastical antlers, griffins with beaks and wings, fish and wild sheep and horses, animals real and imaginary, rendered in blue-black pigment that had endured beneath the skin for 2,500 years. The designs were not random decoration, but symbolic language, statements of identity or status or spiritual protection that the bearers carried through life and into death. We cannot read the symbols with certainty. The Scythians left no texts to explain their meaning, but we can see them, can marvel at their artistry, can recognize that these nomads expressed themselves through their bodies in ways that have echoed through history to modern tattoo culture. The Scythians believed that death was journey, that the dead needed provisions and companions for the crossing. They buried their kings with food and drink, fermented mare's milk in leather bags, lamb and horse meat in dishes, cannabis seeds in copper censers for burning, perhaps to induce visions, or perhaps to ease pain, or perhaps for purposes we cannot guess. They buried them with weapons, bows and arrows, knives and axes, the tools of warriors who lived by raiding and herding, who valued fighting skill as the highest virtue. They buried them with women. The practice is as troubling to modern sensibilities. Sacrificial victims accompanying the dead. Human beings killed to serve in an afterlife we do not believe in. The women in the Prehistoric tombs may have been wives or concubines, may have been willing participants in a ritual they believed would bring honor and reward, may have been slaves or captives given no choice. We cannot know their stories, cannot recover their voices from ice that preserved their bodies, but not their thoughts. We can only witness the evidence of a society that valued some lives enough to preserve them with gold and horses, and valued other lives little enough to end them for the benefit of the first. The Scythian world eventually faded. Other peoples, Sarmatians, Huns, Turks, swept across the steppes, absorbing or displacing the horse nomads who had dominated for centuries. The burial practices changed. The kurgans ceased to rise. The frozen tombs became forgotten mounds on landscapes that nomads continued to cross without knowing what lay beneath. The Scythians entered history through Greek accounts that described them as fierce warriors and heavy drinkers, as masters of the horse and practitioners of strange customs that civilized peoples found both fascinating and repellent. But the ice remembered what history forgot. The frozen tombs preserved what Greek writers could not describe: the textures and colors and craftsmanship, the daily objects and ritual implements, the faces and forms of people who had been abstractions in ancient texts. When archaeologists opened the Prehistoric tombs, they found not just artifacts, but individuals, not just a culture, but human beings who had lived and loved and fought and died and been buried with care by people who mourned them. We close standing beside a Prehistoric kurgan at twilight, the mound a dark curve against mountains that still hold snow on their peaks. The kings are gone now, taken to museums where climate control replaces the cold that preserved them, where millions of visitors see the tattoos and textiles and golden ornaments that the ice held for so long. The tombs are empty. The horses no longer stand in frozen formation. The chambers that once held the preserved dead now hold only memory and the slowly warming earth. The golden kings sleep in museum cases now, far from the steps they rode, far from the grass and wind and endless sky that defined their lives. But for 25 centuries, the ice kept faith. The cold preserved what should have perished. The frozen archive held the Scythian dead until we came ready to receive them, to wonder at them, to tell their stories to listeners who might drift toward sleep while imagining horses running across steppes that stretch beyond sight toward horizons that never end. High on the Ukok Plateau, where the borders of 4 nations dissolve into windswept emptiness, where the sky seems closer than in lowland places, and the silence stretches across miles of grass and stone, a young woman was laid to rest 2,500 years ago. She was perhaps 25 when she died, was perhaps a priestess or healer or person of power whose role we can only guess at from the elaborate care with which she was buried. The ice that formed in her tomb preserved her so completely that when archaeologists opened the chamber in 93, her skin still bore intricate tattoos, her clothing still held its shape, her face still wore an expression that seemed merely sleeping. They call her the Ice Maiden of Ukok, or the Siberian Ice Maiden, or among the Altai people whose ancestors may have buried her, the Princess of Ukok. She has become famous, her image reproduced in books and museums and documentaries, her tattoos inspiring modern artists, her story told in languages she could never have imagined. She has become symbol of the frozen archive's power, proof of what permafrost can preserve when conditions align, when cold penetrates burial chambers and water seeps through log ceilings and freezes, creating ice tombs that hold their contents until someone comes asking questions the dead cannot answer, but their preservation can hint at. The excavation was led by Natalia Polosmak, a Russian archaeologist who had been working in the Altai region for years, who knew the kurgans and their potential, who recognized when her team uncovered ice in a burial chamber that something unusual awaited. The excavation proceeded carefully, melting ice with warm water, working layer by layer through frozen centuries, revealing first the horses, 6 of them, chestnut-colored, their bridles decorated with wooden ornaments covered in gold leaf, their bodies arranged in a row outside the burial chamber proper, and then the chamber itself, its log walls intact, its contents frozen solid. Within the chamber lay a wooden coffin, a single log hollowed out and sealed with copper nails, its exterior decorated with leather applique showing deer, that animal so important to Scythian peoples, appearing again and again in their art, symbol perhaps of the connection between worlds, of the journey the dead must make. Inside the coffin, the maiden lay on her side, her knees slightly bent, her body wrapped in fur, her elaborate headdress collapsed beside her, but its structure still discernible, its height suggesting she had worn something that towered 2 feet or more above her head in life. The headdress was covered with gold, golden deer with their antlers transformed into flowers, golden cats whose eyes seemed to watch from beneath the weight of centuries, golden ornaments that had declared her status to all who saw her in life, and now declared it to all who found her in death. The gold had not tarnished. The craftsmanship remained evident. The headdress spoke of wealth and skill and time invested, spoke of a society that could produce such elaborate objects, that valued this woman enough to bury her with treasures that might have sustained a family for years. But the woman herself commanded more attention than her ornaments. Her body had been mummified, organs removed, cavities filled with peat and bark, the preservation intentional rather than accidental, and then frozen, the ice completing what the embalmers began. Her skin had survived, darkened but intact. Her features remained recognizable. She would be identified as belonging to a genetic population with mixed European and Asian characteristics, her face not quite fitting modern categories, her ancestry reflecting the crossroads nature of the Altai region where east met west across steppes that knew no borders, and her tattoos, the tattoos that have made her famous, that have been reproduced countless times, that seem to speak across millennia of aesthetic values and symbolic meanings we can appreciate even if we cannot fully interpret. On her left shoulder, a fantastical deer with antlers that transformed into flowers, its body twisted in the dynamic pose that characterizes Scythian animal style, its form suggesting movement even in the stillness of preserved skin. On her arm, a spotted snow leopard or similar cat, its tail curled, its form powerful. On her wrist, a deer's head. The blue-black pigment had survived, had remained visible through 25 centuries, had carried her personal story, whatever it was, from her time into ours. What did the tattoos mean? We cannot know with certainty. Perhaps they indicated her role: priestess, healer, person with special access to spiritual realms. Perhaps they documented her life story, achievements or initiations or experiences that the symbols commemorated. Perhaps they provided protection, magical markings that guarded her in life and would guard her in death. The deer with its flowering antlers might represent life force, regeneration, the cycle of seasons that the Scythians followed across their endless migrations. The leopard might represent power, danger, the wildness that nomads understood better than settled peoples. Or the meanings might be entirely different, might be personal rather than symbolic, might be aesthetic rather than meaningful in ways we can understand. With her were buried objects that hint at her life. A dish containing cannabis seeds, suggesting she may have been involved in shamanic practices that use the plant to induce vision. perhaps used for divination, perhaps simply for vanity, perhaps for purposes that combine the two. Containers of food and drink for the journey ahead. The silk blouse she wore, imported from China thousands of miles away. Evidence of trade networks that connected the Altai to the great civilizations of the East. She was not isolated, not primitive, not the simple nomad that stereotypes suggest. She was connected to worlds beyond her plateau, to peoples and goods and ideas that traveled the ancient routes that crossed the heartland of Asia. The discovery brought controversy as well as wonder. The Altai people, whose ancestors may have buried the maiden, objected to her removal. They saw her excavation as desecration, her display as disrespect, her separation from her burial place as spiritual harm that affected not just her, but the land and people she had been meant to protect. They blamed subsequent earthquakes and misfortunes on her disturbed spirit, demanded her return, protested that scientists had no right to remove what had been deliberately buried, what had been meant to remain hidden until the end of time. The debate touches questions that have no easy answers. Who owns the ancient dead? What rights do descendants have over ancestors they never knew? Whose culture they only partly remember? Whose beliefs they cannot fully reconstruct? What responsibilities do scientists have to the peoples whose heritage they study, whose sacred sites they excavate, whose dead they remove to distant museums? The Ice Maiden cannot speak for herself, cannot say whether she would have wanted to be found, whether she would have preferred continued silence in frozen ground, or emergence into the light of scientific inquiry and public display. She rests now in a specially constructed mausoleum in Gorno-Altaisk, returned to her region if not to her exact burial site, kept in conditions that replicate the cold that preserved her. Visitors can see her through glass, can study the tattoos that have made her famous, can contemplate the face that has looked back at viewers since before recorded history began in this part of the world. She is no longer alone in frozen ground. She is surrounded by the curious and the reverent, by scientists and tourists, and indigenous people who claim her as ancestor. She is more known now than she was in life, when only those who saw her could know her. The ice gave her to the world, and the world has made her its own. We close beside her display case, watching her face that seems peaceful, that gives no hint of the controversies her discovery sparked, or the meanings her tattoos might hold. The headdress has been reconstructed beside her, golden deer reaching toward a ceiling that is not the sky of the Yukok Plateau, that is climate controlled and artificially lit and designed to preserve what the ice preserved for so long. She was young when she died, younger than many who visit her now, younger than the span of years she has been famous. She cannot tell us why she was buried with such care, cannot explain what the tattoos meant, cannot say whether she welcomes visitors or would prefer to sleep undisturbed. She can only lie in stillness, her secrets kept, her mysteries intact, her presence speaking more loudly than any words could. The frozen maiden of Yukok, found after 25 centuries of waiting, seen by millions, known by none, forever holding mysteries the ice preserved but could not explain. Where the Bering Strait narrows to its closest point between almost touches America across waters that were once walkable land. Ancient peoples built houses from the bones of whales. The great curved ribs became rafters. The massive skulls became foundations. The vertebrae became seats where hunters gathered to tell stories while blizzards howled outside. The architecture was elegant in its simplicity, using the largest available materials to create shelter against cold that would kill the unprepared within hours, transforming the skeleton of the sea's greatest creature into the framework for human survival at the edge of the habitable world. The Thule culture spread across the Arctic 1,000 years ago, following bowhead whales along migration routes that hugged the coasts of Alaska and Canada and Greenland. These were master hunters, the most successful whale hunters before modern times, capable of killing creatures 50 feet long with technology that seems impossibly simple. Harpoons tipped with stone or bone, floats made from inflated seal bladders that tracked struck whales until they tired, boats made from driftwood and animal skin that could pursue prey across frigid waters, where capsizing meant death within minutes. A single bowhead whale provided enough food to sustain a community for weeks. The blubber burned in lamps that provided both light and heat, the small flames creating warmth that made survival possible in winter darkness that lasted months. The meat and organs fed families. The baleen that hung from the whale's jaw filtered food from seawater and was worked by humans into tools and utensils. The skin covered boats and homes. The bones became structural materials. Nothing was wasted. Everything served purpose. The Thule lived within systems of remarkable efficiency, extracting from their environment exactly what they needed and no more, sustainable in ways that modern civilizations struggle to replicate. The whalebone houses were partly underground, their lower portions dug into frozen ground that provided insulation against cold that could reach 60 degrees below zero. The whale ribs arched overhead, covered with sod and snow and animal skins that created layers of protection between the warm interior and the hostile exterior. Entry was through tunnels that dipped below floor level, creating cold traps that kept frigid air from flowing into living spaces. Inside, seal oil lamps burned with steady flames, their light reflecting off walls glistening with ice crystals, their heat raising temperatures enough that inhabitants could remove heavy clothing, could live in relative comfort while death lurked inches away. The permafrost preserved these houses long after they were abandoned. At archaeological sites across the Arctic, the whale ribs still arch skyward, still frame views of sky and sea, still testify to human ingenuity that made survival possible in conditions that should have been unsurvivable. The bones have weathered thousands of years of freeze and thaw, of wind and rain and snow, of lichens slowly eating at calcium, but they remain. The skulls still settle into ground that has held them since before European explorers reached these shores. The architecture speaks across centuries of people who understood their environment, who worked with what was available, who created from death the conditions for continued life. The frozen sites have yielded more than architecture. The permafrost preserved artifacts that would have rotted in warmer climates. frozen sites show sophisticated construction, multiple layers of furs and skins designed to trap air, to create insulation, to keep hunters alive during hours-long waits on ice, waiting for seals to surface. The needles and thread preserved beside the clothing show the skills required to create such garments, the careful work that stood between humans and the cold that surrounded them. Food preserved in frozen caches tells of diet and season, of what the Arctic provided and when. Whale meat and seal meat, fish and birds, berries gathered during the brief summer and frozen for winter use. The analysis of preserved food reveals not just what people ate, but how they thought about nutrition, how they balanced proteins and fats and vitamins in an environment where scurvy and starvation were constant threats. The Thule ate foods rich in vitamin C, whale skin and organs, plants when available, without knowing the science that would later explain why such foods were essential. Their knowledge was practical rather than theoretical, passed through generations of trial and error, preserved in custom rather than in books. And the frozen sites have yielded human remains, bodies preserved in permafrost, their features recognizable, their clothing intact, their causes of death sometimes visible in preserved tissue. A woman who died in childbirth 500 years ago, her body found with her unborn child. A hunter who died of disease, his symptoms preserved for modern diagnosis. Children and elders, men and women, the full spectrum of humanity frozen in the positions in which death found them. The preservation is intimate, is almost invasive. We see these ancient people more clearly than we might wish, see them in death as they would not have wished to be seen, see details they would have kept private had they known strangers would someday gaze upon their remains. The relationship between the Thule and their whales was not simply predator and prey. The archaeological evidence suggests ritual, suggests respect, suggests a worldview in which whales were persons deserving of honor, even as they were killed for food. Carvings depict whales with care and detail that suggests admiration. Burial practices suggest that whale spirits were believed to survive death, to return to the sea, to be reborn as new whales that would once again give themselves to hunters who showed proper respect. The hunting was killing, was violence, was the taking of life for human benefit. But it was also relationship, was exchange, was compact between humans who needed whales and whales who, in the Thule worldview, chose to be hunted. Modern descendants of the Thule continue to hunt whales, though in reduced numbers, though with engines and rifles alongside traditional weapons, though in a world that has complicated their ancient practices with international law and commercial competition and climate change that alters the patterns their ancestors learned. The hunts connect present to past, connect modern Inuit and Yupik communities to ancestors who built whalebone houses and survived winters that would kill outsiders in hours. The connection is not merely cultural, but physical. The same genetic lines that learned to live at the edge of the world still live there, still hunt the same waters, still know the cold as intimately as their ancestors knew it. The Arctic is changing. The ice that once covered these waters year-round now retreats in summer, opening shipping lanes that would have been impassable a generation ago. The permafrost that preserved the whalebone houses is thawing, releasing their contents, threatening to destroy the archaeological record that the cold preserved. The whales still migrate through the strait, but their patterns are shifting with the changing ice, their populations stressed by warming waters and increasing ship traffic. The world that created whalebone houses is transforming into something different, something that may or may not sustain the peoples who have lived here for millennia. We close standing in the ruins of a whalebone house, the ribs still arching skyward like a cathedral's vaults, the skulls still settled into permafrost that has held them for centuries. The wind speaks in tones that might be whale song, might be distant memory, might be the voice of ice that is slowly retreating. The structure is fragile now. The permafrost that anchored the bones is softening. The ground that held the houses stable is shifting. The architecture that survived centuries may not survive decades more. The whalebone houses are testimony to human adaptation, to the partnership between hunters and hunted, to the ingenuity that made survival possible at the edge of the habitable world. They are also testimony to impermanence, to the fragility of what the cold preserved, to the changes that warming brings. The whalebones frame the sky. The wind carries stories we cannot quite hear. And in the space between what was preserved and what is melting, the edge of the world whispers secrets that are emerging now, in this time of transformation, in this moment when the frozen archive opens and what it held begins to slip away in the depths of Arctic caves, where darkness is absolute and cold has reigned since before humans existed. Ancient peoples lit fires that left traces still visible in soot-stained ceilings. This seems impossible. Fire in places that now freeze even in summer. Warmth in chambers where ice covers the floor and crystalline formations grow from walls like frozen flowers. But the impossible is merely the forgotten. The soot remains. The bone fragments remain. The marks on walls that might be art or might be mere scratching remain. And in their persistence, they speak of times when humans pushed into landscapes that should have been uninhabitable, when they carried fire into darkness and made homes in places that would become deadly when the climate shifted. The bluefish caves of Yukon lie along a river that flows toward the Arctic Ocean, their mouths opening onto landscapes that have changed beyond recognition since humans first sheltered within them. The caves are small, not the vast chambers of European cave systems, but modest overhangs that provided protection from wind and precipitation, that concentrated the heat of small fires enough to make occupation possible in cold that would otherwise have been fatal. The excavations here have yielded evidence that pushes back the timeline of human presence in the Americas by thousands of years. Bone fragments bearing cut marks from stone tools, testimony that someone stood in this darkness 24,000 years ago, long before the conventional dating of human arrival in the New World. The evidence is controversial. Some scientists accept the cut marks as proof of human presence. Others argue that the marks could have been made by natural processes, by teeth rather than tools, by grinding in sediment rather than butchering. The debate continues, but the possibility remains that humans reached the Americas far earlier than previously believed, that they survived in conditions that seem impossible, that they made their way across Beringia and into a new continent, while ice sheets blocked the routes we assumed they must have traveled. Fire made it possible. Fire was the technology that allowed tropical primates to become Arctic hunters, that extended the habitable world beyond any boundary that evolution had prepared humans to cross. The control of fire, not its discovery, which other human species had achieved much earlier, but its mastery, its transportation, its maintenance through seasons when natural fires were rare, was perhaps the most consequential technological achievement in human history. Fire gave warmth when warmth was unavailable. Fire gave light when darkness lasted months. Fire cooked at food that would have been indigestible raw. Fire frightened predators who feared its flames. Fire made humans the most dangerous creatures on the planet, capable of surviving in any environment that provided fuel to burn. The frozen caves preserve not just the fact of ancient fire, but its residue. Soot on ceilings, charcoal in sediments, burned bone that indicates cooking. The preservation is fragmentary. Fires leave less evidence than one might expect, and much of what they leave can be explained by natural processes, but cumulatively convincing. People were here. They lit fires here. They survived in conditions that modern humans would find lethal without massive technological support. The caves were not homes in any permanent sense. The occupation was seasonal, was temporary, was part of mobile lifeways that followed game across landscapes that have since been transformed by climate change. But for the time they stayed, for the nights they spent watching flames dance on cave walls, the caves were shelter, were safety, were the margin between survival and the cold that waited just outside the circle of firelight. Other caves tell similar stories. In Russia, built along rivers that now freeze solid show evidence of Pleistocene occupation, of fires that warmed people who hunted mammoths and horses on steppes that have since become taiga forest. In Alaska, caves and rock shelters have yielded tools and food remains that document thousands of years of human presence in the Arctic. The caves were not chosen randomly. They were selected for qualities that modern visitors might not recognize, for aspects of position and exposure that ancient peoples understood through generations of accumulated knowledge. The caves that preserved evidence were not the only caves used. They were the caves where conditions allowed preservation, where permafrost formed and held, where the frozen archive recorded what happened and kept that record through millennia. The paradox of fire and ice haunts these sites. The flames that made occupation possible also created the conditions that could destroy the evidence. Burning consumes, reduces, transforms organic material into ash that might blow away or wash away or simply become unrecognizable. What survives is what escaped the fire's immediate vicinity, what fell into permafrost before bacteria could consume it, what the cold claimed and kept. The preservation is selective, is incomplete, is shaped by processes that we cannot fully reconstruct. We see shadows of ancient fires, glimpses of in the American Arctic, whether because the peoples did not make them, or because conditions did not preserve them, or because we simply have not found them yet. They left no texts, no symbols that we can interpret, no language that we can reconstruct. They left only the residue of their presence, the soot and the bones and the stone tools that tell us they were here, that they survived, that they did what seemed impossible and left traces that the ice would keep until we came searching. The caves are silent now. The fires are long extinguished. The peoples who lit them dispersed across a continent, became the ancestors of nations that would not know they had come from such places, that would not remember the caves and the cold and the fires that made survival possible. The genetic heritage persists. Modern indigenous peoples of the Americas carry DNA that traces back to those ancient pioneers, that connects living humans to shadows on cave walls, to soot on ceilings, to fires that burned when mammoths still walked outside. We close contemplating the paradox of fire and ice, of warmth preserved by cold, of presence documented through absence. The caves are silent now, their fires extinguished for millennia, their inhabitants scattered to whatever fates awaited them. But the soot remains, the bones remain, the cut marks remain, and in their persistence, something of those unknown people remains too. Not their names or their stories, but the simple fact that they were here, that they lit fires, that they survived, that they passed through darkness and left traces that the ice would keep until we came searching. The eternal flame is not a flame at all, is the memory of flame, the residue of warmth, the testimony of human resilience in conditions that should have been fatal. The caves remember what we cannot know. The ice holds what fire left behind. And somewhere in the darkness of frozen chambers, the ghost of ancient warmth still lingers, preserved by the cold that extinguished it, waiting for the light of discovery that has finally come beyond the frozen passes of the Tian Shan Mountains, where altitude and cold combine to preserve what warmer climates consumed. The Silk Road left traces that time forgot to erase. The great trade route connecting east and west is usually imagined as desert path, camel caravans crossing Taklamakan sands, oasis cities shimmering in heat, merchants negotiating in bazaars fragrant with spices and loud with languages from a dozen lands. But the Silk Road had northern branches, high mountain roads, where snow fell even in summer, where passes rose above 15,000 feet, where the cold that made travel dangerous also preserved evidence of those who traveled. The Tarim Basin lies at the heart of these routes, a depression surrounded by mountains, its floor occupied by desert, but its edges touching highlands where conditions allowed remarkable preservation. Here, in cemeteries that modern construction accidentally discovered, bodies lay preserved by dry cold and salt, mummified by natural processes that arrested decay before it could begin. The Tarim mummies have sparked controversy and wonder since their discovery in the early 20th century, not just for their preservation, but for their features, which include characteristics that seem out of place in Central Asia, that challenge simple narratives of who lived where and when. The beauty of Lulan is perhaps the most famous, a woman who died 4,000 years ago, her face still recognizable, her skin dried but intact, faces, light-colored hair, features that did not match the peoples who have inhabited this region in historical times. The discoveries challenged assumptions about the population history of Central Asia, suggested that peoples we think of as European had reached the center of the continent far earlier than anyone expected. The controversy surrounding the Tarim mummies has political dimensions. In a region where ethnic identity is contested, where modern Uyghurs assert historical claims that Chinese authorities dispute, the mummies became evidence in arguments about who was here first, who has rights to the land, who belongs, and who is interloper. The debates often generate more heat than light. The mummies are 4,000 years old, too ancient to support claims about modern nations, too far removed to settle questions about contemporary politics. But the political significance ensures attention, ensures that the Tarim mummies remain famous, ensures that their enigmatic presence continues to inspire questions that science alone cannot answer. Setting politics aside, the mummies speak of lives lived at the crossroads of civilizations. Their clothing includes textiles that suggest connections to both East and West, wool woven in patterns that echo Scottish tartans, silk that must have come from China, felt that resembles Central Asian nomadic traditions. The people who wore these clothes were not isolated in their desert basin. They were connected to worlds beyond the mountains, trading with peoples they might never see, wearing goods that had traveled thousands of miles along routes that would later become the famous Silk Road. The preservation extends beyond the bodies to their belongings. Leather boots still show the impression of feet that wore them. Bags hold remnants of wheat and millet, evidence of agriculture in a region now too dry to farm without irrigation. Wooden combs and bronze mirrors, felt hats and leather bags, the everyday objects that normally perish within decades remain intact after 4 millennia. The intimacy is striking. We can see the weave of their clothes, the knots in their hair, the dental problems they suffered in lives lived long before modern medicine. The Silk Road proper came later. The formal trade routes that connected Han China to the Roman Mediterranean, that carried silk westward and glass eastward, that facilitated cultural exchange on unprecedented scale. But the Tarim mummies prove that the connections were older, that peoples were moving and trading across Central Asia long before empires formalized the routes. The Bronze Age inhabitants of the Tarim Basin were early participants in networks that would eventually become the most famous trade routes in history. They were predecessors, pioneers, people who traveled the paths that later merchants would follow without knowing who had walked before them. The mountains that separated these peoples from the outside world also preserved them. The high passes that made travel difficult also created conditions where cold and dryness could halt decay. The isolation that limited contact also limited disturbance. The cemeteries lay undisturbed for millennia because no one lived near enough to disturb them. The Tarim Basin became a kind of natural museum, its dry cold preserving what wetter or warmer places would have dissolved into anonymity. The written records that would later document Silk Road trade are absent for the Tarim mummies. They predate writing in this region by millennia, left their stories in bodies bodies and belongings, rather than in texts we can read. We can see what they wore and what they ate, can trace their trade connections through the origin of their goods, can analyze their DNA to reconstruct their genetic heritage, but we cannot know what they called themselves, cannot recover their language, cannot understand their beliefs about the afterlife that led them to bury their dead with such care. They are visible but voiceless, present but silent, preserved in remarkable detail that cannot answer the questions we most want to ask. We close contemplating the frozen branch of the Silk Road, the high passes where snow preserved what desert would have destroyed, the mountain routes where altitude created conditions for remarkable preservation. The trade routes they traveled still echo in the world's connection, still whisper of times when silk flowed westward and bronze flowed eastward, and somewhere in between, on frozen paths no one now travels. Cultures mixed in ways the cold preserved, and we can only partly understand. The Tarim mummies rest in museum cases now, their faces visible beneath glass, their stories forever incomplete. But the trade routes they traveled have never truly closed. The connections they participated in have only grown stronger, and in their preserved bodies, we see evidence of human mobility, human exchange, human connection across distances that should have been insurmountable. The silk flows, the road continues, and the frozen branch remembers what warmer roots forgot. Above the snow line of the Andes, where altitude steals breath and cold penetrates to bone, where peaks rise so high that nothing lives except the hardiest lichens and the rarest birds, the Inca brought children to mountaintop sanctuaries and left them for the gods. This was Capacocha, the Inca practice of human sacrifice that selected the most perfect children from across the empire, dressed them in the finest textiles, fed them the most sacred foods, and guided them into sleep from which they would not wake. The cold that killed them also preserved them, mummifying their bodies through freeze-drying rather than through embalming, creating natural mummies that would wait for centuries until climbers found them. The Lulailaco children are among the best preserved. Discovered in 1909 on a peak that rises over 22,000 feet along the border between Argentina and Chile, 3 children, 2 girls and a boy, had been offered to the mountain gods approximately 500 years ago. The preservation is extraordinary. The 15-year-old girl, known as La Doncella, the maiden, looks as if she might be sleeping. Her face is peaceful, her features intact, her hair still braided in dozens of small plaits, her skin still bearing evidence of a recent illness, her stomach still containing traces of coca leaves chewed in her final hours. The preservation allows us to reconstruct their final days with disturbing clarity. Analysis of hair shows increasing consumption of coca and chicha, corn beer, in the months before death, suggesting a period of ritual preparation during which the children were fed substances that altered their consciousness, that may have made them more compliant, that certainly marked them as special, as sacred, as destined for something beyond ordinary life. The maiden's hair shows a marked increase in coca consumption in her final weeks, suggesting intensification of ritual as the sacrifice approached. Their clothing speaks of status and care. Elaborate textiles, finely woven and decorated suggest that these were not mere victims, but were participants in cosmic drama, were believed to become divine upon death, were honored rather than simply killed, were given treasures that testified to their importance in a worldview where such sacrifice maintained the order of the universe. The practice disturbs modern sensibilities. These were children. The Yulalako boy was perhaps 7, the younger girl perhaps 6. They could not have understood what was happening, could not have given meaningful consent to their deaths, were selected by adults for reasons the children themselves could not have grasped. The fact that they were honored, that their deaths were believed to benefit their communities, that their families may have considered selection a blessing, none of this erases the fact of children killed by adults, of lives ended before they properly began, of human sacrifice that we cannot condone, regardless of the cultural context that produced it. Yet, the complexity refuses simple judgment. The Inca believed that the mountains were deities, that they controlled weather and water, and the prosperity that depended on both. They believed that the most precious offering, more precious than gold, more precious than anything, was human life, specifically the lives of children who embodied perfection and potential. They believed that the sacrificed children did not die, but were transformed, became supernatural beings who continued to protect their communities, who joined the mountain deities in their eternal existence. The belief does not excuse the killing, but it contextualizes it, reveals the worldview that made such acts not merely acceptable, but sacred. The mountains have revealed other sacrificed children as the glaciers retreat. Juanita, the ice maiden of Ambato, emerged from retreating ice in 1995, a girl of perhaps 14, killed by a blow to the head, her body preserved by the altitude cold that had held her for 5 centuries. Other peaks have yielded other offerings, children and sometimes adults, treasures and ritual objects, the traces of ceremonies performed at heights that seem impossibly difficult to reach. The Inca climbed these mountains without modern equipment, without supplemental oxygen, without the technology that makes extreme mountaineering possible today. They did so carrying children and offerings, did so in service of beliefs that drove them to extraordinary physical achievement. The retreating glaciers are a double gift and loss. They reveal what was hidden, allow us to study what we could not otherwise know, connect us to peoples whose practices we might prefer to forget. But they also destroy. The preservation that the ice provided ends when the ice melts, and mummies that have survived centuries can decay within days once exposed to warmer conditions. The race to find and preserve these offerings before they disappear is ongoing. The mountains are giving up their dead, but they are also taking them back, dissolving what the cold held into the anonymity that normally claims the ancient dead. What do we owe the sacrificed children? The question has no easy answer. They were killed in practices we condemn, were victims of beliefs we cannot share, were taken from families who may or may not have welcomed their selection. But they were also honored, were treated with care that their preservation demonstrates, were considered sacred in ways that our secular age cannot quite comprehend. They wait in museum cases now, studied by scientists, viewed by visitors, known to millions who could not have imagined them. Their deaths served purposes we reject. Their preservation serves purposes their killers could not have imagined. We close on the mountaintops where these sanctuaries still stand, where retreating glaciers reveal new offerings, where the cold is slowly surrendering secrets kept for centuries. The sacrificed children look out from frozen sleep with faces that refuse easy interpretation. They were victims, and they were sacred. They were killed, and they were honored. And in the space between our judgment and their community's beliefs, something remains unresolved. Not comfortable, not easy, but true to the complexity of what humans have done in the name of the divine. The peaks remain. The children wait. And somewhere between horror and understanding, between condemnation and comprehension, the frozen sacrifice speaks of human capacity for both cruelty and devotion, for both harm and reverence, for holding these contradictions together in ways that our simpler categories cannot contain. The high peaks, the sacred cold, the children who became gods, forever preserved, forever troubling, forever reminding us of what we are capable of believing and doing in the name of what we hold sacred. 4,000 years ago, when the pyramids of Egypt already stood ancient beneath the sun, when Sumerian scribes were pressing wedges into clay tablets, when bronze had transformed warfare and commerce across the civilized world, mammoths still walked on a small island in the Arctic Ocean. Wrangel Island lies north of Siberia, separated from the mainland by sea that had drowned the land bridge connecting it to the larger world. And on this remote refuge, the last mammoths survived for thousands of years after their kind had gone extinct everywhere else. The island became their final sanctuary, their last stand, their graveyard. The mammoths of Wrangel Island were different from their mainland ancestors, smaller, dwarfed by the limited resources of their island home, shrunk by evolution's response to restricted food supply and limited space. Inbred. Genetic analysis shows decreasing diversity over generations, the inevitable consequence of a small population breeding only with each other for millennia, isolated, cut off from any possibility of encountering other mammoths, from any fresh genetic input, from any rescue from the slow decline that isolation typically brings. The island preserved what the mainland consumed: bones scattered across tundra, tusks protruding from riverbanks, remains that had been frozen since before human civilizations rose in warmer lands. The permafrost of Wrangel Island became Mammoth Cemetery, holding the evidence of the last years of the species that had once dominated northern landscapes from Europe to America. The bones tell stories of diminishing health, of dental problems that suggest nutritional deficiency, of bone anomalies that suggest inbreeding depression, of a population that was surviving but was not thriving. What killed the last mammoths? The question has occupied scientists for decades. Climate change was likely a factor. Wrangel Island's environment was shifting, even in the relatively stable period after the Ice Age's end, becoming less hospitable to large grazers, supporting less of the grassland vegetation that mammoths needed. Inbreeding depression may have contributed. Small populations accumulate harmful mutations, population already weakened by other factors. Humans may or may not have reached Wrangel Island while mammoths still lived there. The archaeological evidence is ambiguous. Some artifacts suggest human presence around the time of mammoth extinction. Others suggest humans arrived later. If humans did encounter the last mammoths, the meeting would have been poignant. People who had never seen such creatures who had never seen such predators, a first contact that would have ended badly for the mammoths if it happened at all. A few hunters could have finished what climate and isolation had begun. The last mammoth on Wrangel Island died approximately 3,700 years ago. We cannot know the circumstances, whether death came suddenly through predation or accident, whether it came slowly through starvation or disease, whether the last mammoth knew it was the last, or whether such awareness was beyond mammoth cognition. We know only that after that death, the species that had survived for millions of years was gone. The tusks would continue to emerge from permafrost. The bones would continue to litter the tundra, but the creatures that had made them were gone from the world. The extinction went unnoticed by human civilizations. When the last mammoth died, pharaohs were ruling Egypt. The Shang dynasty was rising in China. The Minoans were building their labyrinthine palaces on Crete. None of them knew that mammoths had ever existed. The creatures had gone extinct on the mainland thousands of years before writing could record their presence. They became myths, became confused legends, became the tusks that washed up on beaches and were interpreted as dragon teeth or giant's bones. The memory of mammoths faded before history could preserve it. The frozen remains of Wrangel Island's mammoths have given scientists extraordinary information. DNA extracted from bones and teeth has allowed reconstruction of mammoth genomes with a remarkable completeness. Comparison with elephant DNA has revealed the genetic differences that made mammoths mammoths, the adaptations for cold, the differences in blood chemistry, the variations in hemoglobin that allowed efficient oxygen delivery in frigid temperatures. The information has fueled dreams of de-extinction, of using genetic engineering to create mammoth-elephant hybrids, of returning something like mammoths to landscapes they once roamed. Whether de-extinction is possible or desirable remains hotly debated. The technical challenges are enormous. Recreating a mammoth requires more than just genome, requires understanding how genes express in development, requires creating embryos and finding surrogate mothers among elephants who have never carried mammoth-like fetuses. The ethical questions are equally daunting. What is the purpose of bringing back a species that went extinct naturally, that has no ecosystem to return to, that might suffer in captivity without companions of its kind? The dreams persist despite the challenges, fueled by fascination with creatures that the ice preserved but could not protect. Wrangel Island is protected now, a nature reserve where polar bears and walruses and Arctic foxes carry on without the mammoths that once shared their landscape. The permafrost is thawing here as elsewhere, releasing mammoth bones that had been frozen for millennia, exposing tusks that ivory hunters prize, surrendering secrets that scientists scramble to recover before they are lost. The island that preserved the last mammoths is slowly giving them up, releasing what it held, returning to the surface what the cold had kept hidden. We close contemplating the emptiness that mammoth extinction represents. The species that had survived ice ages, that had adapted to the coldest conditions the planet could produce, that had ranged across continents and crossed land bridges and populated every suitable habitat in the northern hemisphere. That species ended on a small island in the Arctic, dwindled to a final individual, died without descendants, became extinct. The extinction happened naturally, or mostly naturally. Humans may have contributed, but did not cause the decline that made the last mammoth vulnerable. The loss is no less real for being natural. The silence where mammoths once trumpeted is no less absolute for being old. The mammoth graveyard of Wrangel Island testifies to both survival and failure. Survival, because the mammoths persisted for thousands of years after their mainland extinction, because they adapted to island conditions, because they held on in their refuge while human civilizations rose in warmer lands. Failure, because they ultimately could not sustain themselves, because their isolation became their doom, because being the last is not the same as being immortal. The bones remain, the tusks remain, the frozen tissue from which DNA can be extracted remains. But the mammoths are gone. The island keeps their graves, and in the silence where trumpeting should sound, extinction speaks more loudly than any voice that once filled these Arctic landscapes. On the edge of the habitable world, where Eric the Red gave an icy land a verdant name to attract settlers, Norse farmers lived for 5 centuries before vanishing into the cold they had briefly defied. They came from Iceland around the year 980 BF, following Eric's tales of green pastures and abundant game, establishing farms along fjords that seemed for a time capable of supporting the European way of life they carried with them. They built churches and raised cattle, hunted seals and traded with passing ships, maintained connections to Europe that were tenuous but never entirely broken. And then they disappeared. The medieval warm period made Greenland habitable. Relatively mild temperatures allowed grass to grow in protected valleys, allowed cattle to graze through longer summers, allowed the Norse to practice the agriculture that defined their culture. They grew barley in good years, kept cows and sheep and goats, supplemented their diet with seals and caribou and fish. The eastern settlement, closer to Europe, thrived with perhaps 4,000 inhabitants at its peak. The western settlement, farther into the island's interior, was smaller but viable. For over 400 years, the Norse persisted at the edge of the world. The graves they left tell stories of gradual decline. The permafrost that eventually claimed their cemeteries preserved their dead with remarkable completeness, bodies still clothed, features still recognizable. The details of their lives written in bones and fabric, and the content of their stomachs. The clothing shows adaptation to cold, heavier fabrics than their European contemporaries wore, layered garments designed to trap warmth. But the clothing also shows isolation. Fashions decades out of date compared to Europe, styles that had gone obsolete because no one brought news of current trends, evidence of a community cut off from the cultural currents that shaped their homeland. The bones tell harder stories, evidence of becoming something different from their ancestors, were becoming people of the Arctic, whether they recognized it or not. But they did not change enough, did not adopt the technologies and practices that allowed the Inuit to thrive in conditions that destroyed the Norse. The Little Ice Age began around 1300, and conditions that had been difficult became impossible. Summers shortened, winters deepened. The grass that had fed their cattle grew scarcer. Ships from Europe came less frequently as sea ice made the voyage more dangerous. The western settlement was abandoned first. When a priest sailed there in 1342 to check on the community, he found empty farms, cattle dead in their stalls, people gone without explanation. The abandonment appears sudden, the departure hurried, the destination unknown. The eastern settlement persisted longer, but fared no better. The last written record is a wedding in 1408 at Avalsi Church, a marriage that took place in a community that was dying, that celebrated union in a place that would soon hold only corpses and silence. After 1408, no one wrote of the Greenland Norse. No ships returned to European ports with news of what had happened. The community that had maintained Christianity and European identity at the edge of the world simply ceased to exist. What happened to them? The question has occupied historians for centuries. Did they starve as the climate worsened and their farming failed? Did they abandon their settlements and merge with the Inuit peoples who successfully inhabited the same coast? Did disease sweep through communities already weakened by malnutrition? Did they attempt to sail to North America and perish in the attempt? Did some combination of disasters overwhelm their capacity to respond? The records do not say. The graves do not answer. The frozen earth keeps its counsel. The Inuit encounter complicates the narrative. Native peoples who had developed sophisticated technologies for Arctic survival, kayaks and umiaks, harpoons and toggling points, clothing designed for extreme cold, hunting techniques refined over millennia, were living along the same coasts where the Norse struggled. Contact between the groups occurred. Norse accounts mention encounters with the people they called Skraelings, and Inuit oral traditions speak of the Kavlunait or Kalunat who lived in stone houses and raised animals. But the encounters did not lead to cultural exchange that might have saved the Norse. They maintained their European identity to the end, refusing or unable to adopt the Inuit adaptations that made Arctic survival possible. The Valsi Church still stands, the best preserved Norse ruin in Greenland, its stone walls intact, though its roof has long since fallen. This is where the last recorded wedding took place, where the last documented event in Greenland Norse history occurred, where whatever community remained gathered for a celebration that the written record noticed before falling silent. Visitors stand in the roofless church now, gazing at walls that witnessed the end of a civilization, contemplating the view of the fjord that the wedding guests saw, imagining the mixture of celebration and foreboding that must have accompanied the ceremony. The permafrost is surrendering what it held. Climate change is thawing the Greenland soil, exposing artifacts that had been frozen for centuries, releasing organic materials that can now be studied, but that also begin to decay the the moment they emerge. The graves are opening, not because archaeologists are digging, but because the ground itself is softening, because the cold that preserved is retreating, because the frozen archive is becoming unfrozen, and what it held is slipping away. The race to study the Norse Greenland remains, before they are lost, is ongoing. The warming that destroyed the Norse settlement is now destroying the evidence of its destruction. We close standing in the ruins of Hvalsey Church, the walls still framing a view of the fjord. The settlement around it returned to Tundra that does not remember it was ever farm. The Norse are gone, their descendants either dead or absorbed into other populations. Their 5 centuries of presence on this island reduced to ruins and graves and the words of a few medieval documents. They came with hopes of prosperity, maintained their way of life for over 400 years, and finally succumbed to forces they could not control. Climate change, isolation, perhaps their own unwillingness to change. Their graves remain, preserved by permafrost that is now thawing, testimony to the fragility of human presence in places that barely tolerate us. The cold preserved them. The warmth is releasing them. And somewhere between the ice and the thaw, the Vikings of Greenland speak of endings that could not have been predicted, of civilizations that can fail at the margins, of the silence that falls when the last written record goes unanswered and no one is left to write. Beneath the ice of Antarctica, where no human being walked until the 20th century, where temperatures drop below minus 100 degrees Fahrenheit in winter darkness, forests once grew. This seems impossible, seems like fantasy or mistake or misunderstanding. But the fossil evidence is clear. Petrified wood lies embedded in Antarctic rock. Leaf impressions show the shapes of plants that could not survive an hour of current conditions. Coal seams testify to ancient swamps where vegetation accumulated over millions of years. Antarctica was not always Antarctic. The frozen continent was once green and living, and the ice preserves the evidence of its transformation. The story spans hundreds of millions of years. When Antarctica was part of Gondwana, the supercontinent that included Australia and South America and Africa and India, it sat in different latitudes, experienced different climates, supported ecosystems that have no modern equivalent. The continent drifted south over geological time, moved through tropical and temperate zones, accumulated the fossil evidence of each climate it passed through. The forests grew when Antarctica was warm enough to support them, died when it became too cold, left their remains to be frozen and preserved in the ice that conquered them. Explorers first encountered the evidence in the early 20th century. Robert Falcon Scott's doomed expedition found fossilized plants during their return from the South Pole in 1912, carried the specimens with them as they perished in the cold, left them to be discovered with their bodies by the search parties that came too late. The fossils testified to Antarctic forests that had grown over 200 million years ago, to a time when the continent was part of a larger landmass, to ecosystems that had vanished so completely that only stone remained to prove they had existed. The petrified forests of Antarctica are not forests of familiar trees. ancestors of modern conifers. Others show plants that have no living descendants, species that went extinct long before the cold came, that would have vanished even if Antarctica had remained warm. The forest changed over the hundreds of millions of years they existed, evolved and transformed, and gave way to successor forests until the cold made all forests impossible. The transition to ice was gradual by human standards, but rapid by geological measure. Antarctica reached the South Pole approximately 40 million years ago, and the cooling began almost immediately. Ice caps formed on the highlands, expanded to cover the continent, grew to the miles-thick ice sheet that covers Antarctica today. The cooling was not steady. There were warm intervals, brief returns of temperate conditions, times when forests may have briefly returned to coastal areas. But the overall trend was inexorable. The cold conquered, the ice grew, the green became white. The ice preserves more than fossils. Antarctica's ice sheet is archive of climate history, holding bubbles of ancient atmosphere trapped when snow compressed into ice. Scientists drill ice cores hundreds of thousands of years deep, analyze the gases in the bubbles, reconstruct the composition of ancient atmospheres with precision that seems magical. The cores show fluctuations in carbon dioxide and methane, show the rhythm of ice ages and warm periods, show the climate that the forests experienced before they died, and the climate that replaced them. The frozen continent also preserves meteorites, rocks from space that fall everywhere on Earth, but that are easier to find on Antarctic ice. The dark stones stand out against white background, collect in areas where ice flow concentrates them, wait for scientists to retrieve them. The meteorites include pieces of Mars and the Moon, fragments blasted off other worlds by ancient impacts, sent wandering through space until Earth's gravity captured them. Antarctica's ice preserved these extraterrestrial visitors, kept them from weathering away as they would have in warmer climates, created a repository of space rocks that has transformed our understanding of the solar system. The scale of Antarctic preservation staggers comprehension. Miles of ice, accumulated over millions of years, holding in frozen suspension the atmosphere of ages past. The fossils of vanished forests, the rocks from other worlds. The continent is museum and archive, repository and record, the largest frozen preservation site on the planet. What it holds could fill libraries with information about Earth's history, about climate change, about the transformations that have made our planet what it is today. The ice is vast, but not invulnerable. Climate change is affecting even Antarctica, warming the peninsula that reaches towards South America, destabilizing ice shelves that had seemed permanent, raising questions about what will happen when, not if. The warming that is already occurring intensifies. The West Antarctic ice sheet is particularly vulnerable. Its base below sea level, its stability dependent on conditions that are changing. If it melts, sea levels will rise by 10 feet or more, enough to reshape coastlines worldwide, enough to flood cities home to hundreds of millions of people. The frozen forests will not return. Even if Antarctica warms substantially, even if the ice sheets melt and the continent becomes accessible to vegetation, the forests that grew there cannot be recreated. The species are extinct. The ecosystems are gone. The particular configurations of life that produced those forests depended on conditions that existed hundreds of millions of years ago and will not recur. What might grow if Antarctica warms will be different, will be descended from plants that currently exist, will be shaped by conditions that the ancient forests never faced, will be new in ways we cannot predict. We close meditating on timescales that exceed human comprehension. The millions of years required to create and then destroy these forests, the patience of ice that eventually conquers, the impermanence of conditions that seem eternal. Antarctica's frozen forests are gone beyond recovery, transformed into stone and coal and memory, but their traces persist, preserved by cold that also destroyed them, testimony to a world before the ice that now defines this continent. The pole remembers what we never knew. The ice keeps records we are only beginning to read. And somewhere beneath the frozen surface, the ghost of greenness waits. Not for resurrection, for that is impossible, but for recognition that even the most frozen places were once warm. Even the most barren landscapes once teemed with life. Even Antarctica was once a place where forests grew and creatures walked and existence flourished in forms we can only imagine through the fossils the ice preserved. On a remote Norwegian archipelago, halfway between mainland Norway and the North Pole, humanity has buried its agricultural inheritance in frozen rock. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault holds millions of seed samples from around the world, preserved against catastrophe, kept viable by permafrost, that does the work of preservation that electricity and institutions cannot guarantee. The vault is insurance policy against future we hope never arrives, against crop diseases that wipe out food supplies, against climate change that renders current varieties obsolete, against wars and disasters that might destroy the seed collections that individual nations maintain. The vault sits at the end of a tunnel bored into Sandstone Mountain, its entrance visible from distance as a geometric shape emerging from Arctic landscape. A wedge of concrete and steel that looks like something from science fiction, but serves purposes as ancient as agriculture itself. The Svalbard archipelago was chosen for its cold. Even without refrigeration, the permafrost maintains temperatures below freezing year-round. The mountain provides stability. No earthquakes, no volcanoes, no shifting ground that might compromise the vault's integrity. The remoteness provides security. No nearby populations, limited access, distance from conflicts that might threaten more accessible locations. The seeds themselves come from gene banks around the world. More than 100 countries have deposited samples, sending their national agricultural heritage to the Arctic for safekeeping. The collection includes not just staple crops, but rare varieties, ancient cultivars, wild relatives of domestic plants whose genetic diversity might someday prove invaluable. Each sample represents thousands of years of agricultural development, of human selection and cultivation, of the partnership between people and plants that made civilization possible. The vault has already proved its value. In 2015, when war devastated Syria, the gene bank in Aleppo, one of the most important in the Middle East, was threatened. Researchers had previously deposited duplicates of their collection in Svalbard. When they needed seeds to re-establish their bank in Morocco and Lebanon, the Arctic Vault provided them. The withdrawal was the first from the seed vault, proof that the insurance was functional, that the frozen heritage could be retrieved when needed. The collection represents agricultural history made physical, wild wheats from the Fertile Crescent, where agriculture began over 10,000 years ago, rice varieties from Asia, where different cultures independently domesticated the grass that now feeds billions, maize from the Americas, transformed from wild teosinte into a crop so dependent on humans that it cannot reproduce without our help. Potatoes from the Andes, where indigenous peoples developed thousands of varieties adapted to different altitudes and conditions. Each seed carries genetic information accumulated over millennia, information encoded not in writing, but in DNA, information that represents the accumulated agricultural knowledge of humanity. The preservation relies on cold, but not only on cold. The seeds are dried to low moisture content, packed in foil envelopes, sealed in boxes, stored in chambers that maintain temperatures around -18 degrees Celsius. The combination of cold and dryness dramatically extends seed viability. Seeds that might survive only a few years under normal conditions can remain viable for centuries or millennia in the vault's conditions. Some seeds are more durable than others. Cereal seeds can potentially survive for thousands of years, while some tropical species have much shorter lifespans, even in optimal conditions. The vault has faced challenges that reveal the limits of even the best laid plans. In 2017, unusually warm temperatures caused meltwater to seep into the entrance tunnel, not reaching the seed vaults themselves, but demonstrating that even Arctic permafrost is not immune to climate change. Engineers improved the drainage and waterproofing, but the incident served as a reminder that the climate stability the vault depends on cannot be taken for granted. The very conditions that made Svalbard ideal for seed storage are changing, are becoming less reliable, are subject to the same warming that threatens much of the permafrost-dependent infrastructure worldwide. The seeds do not know they are being preserved. They carry no consciousness of their importance, no awareness of the futures they might enable. They simply wait, their metabolic processes slowed almost to nothing, their genetic information held in molecular configurations that could potentially produce plants identical to their parents if given the chance to germinate. They are suspended potential, frozen possibility, hope in the form of tiny packages that could fit in your hand, but that collectively represent the food security of the entire planet. The decision to create the vault reflected awareness that catastrophe is possible, that crop diseases can devastate food supplies, that climate change can render current varieties obsolete, that wars and disasters can destroy the institutions that preserve agricultural diversity. The vault is acknowledging is uncertain, that the civilizations that currently maintain seed banks might not always exist, that preservation requires redundancy and distribution rather than concentration in a few vulnerable locations. It is planning for futures we hope never arrive, preparing for catastrophes we hope never occur. But the vault is also affirmation of continuity, of connection, of the value placed on agricultural heritage that might easily have been forgotten. Every seed deposited represents someone's decision that this variety mattered, that this genetic combination was worth preserving, that the future might need what the past created. The affirmation transcends borders and conflicts, brings together nations that might disagree on everything else, creates shared project in which humanity as a whole invests in humanity's shared future. We close in the silence of the vault, where nothing grows, where life is suspended in frozen waiting. The seeds do not know they are preserved. They carry no consciousness of their importance. They simply wait, holding patterns that could become wheat or rice or orchids, holding potential that may never be activated or may someday rebuild what was lost. The cold keeps them. The mountain protects them. And in their preservation, something sacred persists, not religion, but faith nonetheless. Faith that the future will need what the past created. Faith that preservation is itself a form of hope. The seed vault, the memory of plants, the inheritance frozen against catastrophe, forever waiting, forever holding possibility, forever testimony that humanity can plan for futures beyond our own lifetimes, can protect heritage we hope our descendants never need to use, but that we preserve nonetheless against the uncertainties that define every future. The permafrost is melting. Across Siberia and Alaska and Canada, ground that has been frozen for tens of thousands of years is releasing what it held. Not just mammoths and ancient hunters, but methane and carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases that will accelerate the warming that caused their release. This final chapter confronts what the thawing means, not with alarm designed to prevent sleep, but with the meditative seriousness the subject demands. We stand at the edge of transformation, watching the earth exhale what it has held since the last ice age, witnessing the opening of an archive that is simultaneously revealing its treasures and destroying them. The feedback loop is simple to describe, but terrifying to contemplate. Warming releases gases that cause more warming that releases more gases. The permafrost holds approximately twice as much carbon as the atmosphere currently contains. Its complete release would transform the climate in ways that models struggle to predict, but that would certainly be severe. The mathematics are planetary in scale, beyond individual influence, subject to processes that began before anyone now alive was born, and that will continue long after we are gone. But the thawing also reveals the same warming that releases methane also releases mammoths, ancient villages, preserved bodies that tell stories we could not otherwise know. The revelation is bittersweet. We learn from what the ice releases, even as we recognize that the release itself is symptom of crisis. The frozen archive is opening, and what it held is emerging into light that will transform it, that will begin the decay that cold prevented, that will return to some hundreds of feet across, their formation explosive as trapped gases burst through weakened surfaces. In Alaska, forests are tilting as the ground beneath them shifts, creating drunken forests where trees lean at angles that healthy ground would not permit. In Canada, roads and buildings constructed on permafrost are failing as their foundations become unstable. The infrastructure that assumed frozen ground would remain frozen is discovering that assumptions based on past conditions may not apply to the future. Indigenous peoples who have lived in permafrost regions for millennia are witnessing transformations their ancestors never saw. Hunting patterns are changing as animals shift their ranges. Traditional food storage methods that relied on frozen ground are becoming unreliable. The knowledge accumulated over generations about how to live in these landscapes is becoming less applicable as the landscapes themselves transform. The changes are not merely environmental, but cultural. The ways of life that permafrost enabled are becoming less viable as permafrost retreats. Scientists race to study what the thawing reveals before it is eased. Mammoth carcasses that emerge from riverbanks begin to decay within days. The remarkable preservation that millennia of freezing provided ends abruptly when thawing occurs. Researchers establish networks of observers, train local people to recognize significant finds, work to retrieve specimens before they are destroyed by the same warming that revealed them. The window for study is brief. What has waited 40,000 years can vanish in a season. The ancient pathogens are emerging too. Anthrax from the carcass of a reindeer that died decades ago killed a child in Siberia in 2010. The bacteria had remained viable in frozen ground, emerged when unusual warmth thawed the carcass. Infected reindeer herds that had not been vaccinated because the disease had not appeared in decades. The incident raised concerns about what else might emerge. What other pathogens might have survived in permafrost? What diseases that disappeared long ago might return when their frozen hosts thaw into a world with no immunity to them? The ivory hunters are active in the thawing. Mammoth tusks, revealed by erosion and spring floods, are valuable enough that people risk dangerous conditions to retrieve them. The hunters are often the first to discover significant specimens and often destroy scientific evidence in the process of extracting the tusks. The tension between economic opportunity and scientific preservation is ongoing. The tusks have value that can be realized immediately. The scientific information has value that requires resources to extract and may not benefit those who find the specimens. What does it mean to live during transformation? The question has no easy answer. We are witnesses to changes that we did not cause, but that our species caused, that were set in motion before we were born, but that our lifetimes are seeing accelerate. We can document what is emerging from the frozen archive, can study what centuries of cold preserved, can learn from the past that the ice is surrendering, but we cannot stop the thawing, cannot restore the permafrost, cannot return what is being released to the frozen suspension that held it. We can only watch and learn and wonder what comes next. The frozen tundra kept its secrets for millennia. Now it speaks, in methane bubbles rising through lakes, in as the ground that buried them melts away. The secrets beneath the frozen tundra are emerging, whether we are ready or not. And in their emergence, they ask us questions. What will we do with what we learn? What will we preserve of what is being lost? What will we leave for those who come after? When the ice has finished its retreat, and the earth has told its final frozen secrets, we close not with answers, but with presence, with attention to the transformation occurring in the frozen places of the world, with awareness that we are living through changes that will define centuries to come. The thawing, the revealing, the ending and beginning that occur together. The ancient secrets emerge, the cold surrenders, and we are left watching, listening, wondering what the warming world will bring, what treasures and what dangers, what knowledge and what loss, what transformation of landscapes that seemed permanent, but that are proving as impermanent as everything else in a world where change is the only constant. The frozen archive closes as we drift toward sleep, but the earth continues its slow exhale, and the secrets it releases will keep emerging long after this night has passed, long after this moment has become memory, long after we have joined the silence that the ice preserved for so long and is now releasing into the warming air. Conclusion: where cold surrenders to memory, the frozen archive closes. The chronicles of what ice preserved and what thawing reveals draw toward their end, not with conclusions, but with continuations, not with answers, but with questions that will outlast this night and this listener and this moment of resting at the edge of sleep. For every secret the frozen tundra has yielded, countless more remain buried. For every mammoth discovered, thousands still wait in Siberian permafrost. For every preserved human found, entire populations lived and died in ways the ice did not record. What we have explored tonight is fragment of the whole, glimpse of the archive's vastness, hint of what cold can preserve when conditions allow and time is patient. We have walked among mammoths whose flesh survived their extinction by 40 millennia, have stood before Scythian kings whose golden ornaments still gleam after 25 centuries, have gazed upon the Ice Maiden whose tattoos speak in symbolic language we cannot read but can admire, have entered whalebone houses that sheltered hunters at the edge of survival, that used the architecture of death to create spaces for continued life, have descended into caves where fire once burned in chambers, now sealed by ice, have followed the Silk Road's frozen branches and climbed Andean peaks where children became offerings, have contemplated the mammoth graveyard where a species made its last stand, have mourned the Vikings who vanished from Greenland, have wondered at forests frozen into Antarctic rock, have visited the vault where seeds wait against catastrophes we hope never arrive, have witnessed the thawing that releases what cold preserved and transforms the landscapes of the frozen world. What have we learned from these frozen chambers of time? That preservation is gift and accident, that the cold's keeping was not intentional but was fortunate, that what survives does so through combination of conditions that cannot be reliably predicted or controlled, that the preserved dead speak to us across distances of time that should have silenced them, that remarkable, that the intimacy of looking upon ancient faces creates connection that transcends the centuries between us, that civilizations can fail at the margins, can persist for centuries before vanishing, can leave traces that wait for discovery long after the last inhabitants have gone. We have learned that the frozen archive is temporary, that the conditions that created it are changing, that what the ice held is being released, sometimes to scientific discovery, sometimes to decay, sometimes to consequences we cannot fully anticipate. The transformation is ongoing, will continue long after this night, will reveal and destroy in measures we cannot predict. We are living through the opening of an archive that took millennia to create and that may empty itself within centuries. But we have also learned that preservation is possible, that human intention can create conditions for holding what might otherwise be lost. The seed vault on its Arctic mountain, the museums where ice maidens rest in climate-controlled cases, the digital archives where images and data preserve what physical specimens cannot survive. These too are frozen archives, extensions of the ice's work into human keeping. We inherit the responsibility of preservation from the cold that is surrendering it. Sleep approaches now, as sleep approaches every evening, as rest claims those who have journeyed through the frozen places of time. The secrets beneath the tundra will continue emerging while you sleep. The earth does not pause for human rest. The thawing does not wait for human attention. The archive does not close because listeners have turned away. But the secrets will still be there when you wake, changed perhaps, transformed perhaps, but present in the world that continues while consciousness releases its hold. Let the cold of the stories we have told settle into comfortable distance. The mammoths cannot reach you. The ice cannot touch you. The permafrost is far from wherever you rest, and the warmth that surrounds you is immediate and present and sufficient. You are safe, and the frozen archive is elsewhere, and the secrets it holds are not threats, but testimonies, evidence that the earth remembers, that preservation is possible, that what seems lost can sometimes be found, that the past speaks to those who learn to listen. The ancient secrets beneath the frozen tundra have waited for millennia. They can wait while you sleep, can wait while dreams carry you through landscapes that may or may not include the frozen places we have explored, can wait while the night deepens and the stars wheel overhead and the earth continues its slow exhale of what it has held since the last ice age. The secrets are patient. The cold taught them patience. And when you wake, they will still be there, emerging, revealing, asking questions that have no easy answers, but that connect us to times and peoples and creatures we could not otherwise know. Rest now. The frozen archive does not require your attention. The mammoths do not need you to witness them. The ice will continue its slow retreat, whether or not any human watches. But you have witnessed, have listened, have traveled through the frozen places of time. And when you wake, you will carry with you the memory of what the ice preserved. Not the details, perhaps, which sleep may dissolve, but the sense of connection to depths of time that the frozen archive makes possible. The cold, the secrets, the preservation and the release, the questions that remain unanswered, all waiting while you sleep, all patient as the ice itself is patient, all holding what they hold until someone comes ready to receive what the frozen earth has to give. Good night. The frozen archive rests now, and so should you. And somewhere in the space between waking and sleeping, between the present warmth and the ancient cold, the secrets whisper still, not demanding attention, but offering presence, offering connection, offering testimony that the earth remembers, and that what it remembers can speak to those who learn to listen. The tundra, the ice, the secrets beneath, forever holding, forever releasing, forever the record of what was and what remains, and what the warming world will bring. Sleep deeply, dream gently, and wake remembering, if only faintly, that beneath the frozen places of the world, the ancient secrets wait, patient, preserved, ready to speak to those who come with questions, and with time, and with willingness to listen to what the ice has held through all the centuries of its keeping.